Okay, this week we are going to be reading A Lost Button from Frog and Toad Are Friends. Some of you have read Frog and Toad stories before, and maybe you've read this story as well, by Arnold Lobel. So the nice thing about this is when I read this story, you can read along with me, and then if you want to rewind the video, or not rewind, I guess you wouldn't do too much of that anymore, but if you wanted to start the video again, you could turn off the sound and you could actually read the story on your own. So that's however you want to do it, or you can keep reading along with me as well. That would be fine. So this genre is fantasy, and again, looking at the pictures, you can tell why it's fantasy. And our question, of course, this week is how we can classify and categorize things. So we're going to read about what happens when Toad loses his button. All right, so here we go. A lost button. Ready? Read. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. Go ahead and look at the picture. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button? I found one." "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. "I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here is one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here is your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor, he saw his white, 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. Okay, great story. Let's meet the author, Arnold Lobel. I always like to read this for you guys so that you know about the author. So Arnold Lobel was often sick and missed many days of school when he was young. When he went back to school, he made friends by telling stories and drawing pictures. Many years later, Lobel's children liked to catch frogs and toads. Lobel loved the animals and wrote about them in his frog and toad stories. So if you enjoyed this story, there's lots of frog and toad stories, and I bet you on Epic Books you can find some other frog and toad stories. I hope you liked the story.